Test. Test 1, 2, 3. Testing 1, 2, 3. Testing 1, 2, 3. Testing 1, 2, 3. And of testing 1, 2, 3. Testing 1, 2, 3. Can y'all put the page back up, please? Put it up.
I'm calling to order this hearing. This is a public hearing of the Committee of the Whole of the District of Columbia. I'm Phil Mendelson, Chairman of the Council and Chair of the Committee of the Whole. Today is Monday, February 13th, 2023. The time is 3:12 in the afternoon. This hearing is being conducted live in Council Hearing Room 123, but is also being broadcast live via the Zoom video conference broadcast platform and the council's website. I'm not sure it's being broadcast live there, but it will be available there. And it's also available live on the chairman's website, which is www.chairmanmendelson.com/live. The subject of this hearing is fiscal year 24 or 2024 DCPS school budget. Reading from the hearing notice, the District of Columbia Public Schools will release the initial budget for each of its 116 schools ahead of the release of the mayor's annual budget. For the past several years, schools have experienced budget instability, sometimes extreme, with little opportunity to acquire additional funding to cover all of the necessary services and supports for students. In December, the council adopted the Schools First in Budgeting Amendment Act of 2022, permanent version of which was Bill 24-570, which requires the mayor and the District of Columbia Public Schools to increase individual school budgets using a specific budget calculation that begins with the school's budget for the previous year. The purpose of this hearing, today's hearing, is to analyze the initial budgets for individual schools to ensure they adhere to the requirements of the law and hear from education stakeholders about how the proposed funding will impact student achievement and supports how the proposed funding will impact student achievement and supports in the coming school year. Today's hearing is not about the overall DCPS budget. That hearing will take place once the budget is submitted by the mayor on March 22nd. Now, my understanding is that the schools have not been informed what their budgets are for next year, although the Schools First in Budgeting Act requires that. And past practice, the schools have been informed by now of their individual budgets for the next fiscal year. So we have two witnesses, government witnesses. We have Deputy Mayor for Education, Paul Kine, and we have DCPS Chancellor Louis Farabee. And we will, after hearing from them and an opportunity for questions, I will recess this hearing and continue the hearing on Friday, February 24th, 2023 at 1 p.m. The record in this matter, according to the hearing notice, will close at 5 p.m. on Monday, February 27th, 2023. I understand there are at least two council members present. Council Member Matt Truman, do you have opening remarks?
Thank you very much, Chairman Medicine. I don't have elaborate remarks, but I have stressed in all my conversations with you and with representatives of DCPS and the deputy mayor how important it is that we not see erosion in the buying power of our school budgets in this year, where it is still a very delicate post-COVID period. And I think that was the spirit of the chairman's legislation. And I hope that that spirit is reflected in the budgets that we eventually see. Many people are sitting on the edge of their seats waiting to see those budgets so they can evaluate where we're at. And I'm hopeful that people will be happy when they see them, but the sooner we can see them, the better. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Councilmember Fruman. Councilmember Henderson, I believe you're here. You have an opening statement. Councilmember Henderson. We will catch her at the after the testimony. The witness list lists the chancellor first and then the deputy mayor, but deputy mayor, my sense from your testimony is you're expecting to go first. No, actually, I'm supposed to swear you in, and we all have to learn things, so you have to learn to turn on your microphone. So Both of you would rise and raise your hands, please. You swear that the testimony you are about to give to the committee, the whole of the Council of the District of Columbia is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Thank you. Each answered in the affirmative, and you may be seated. So who's first? You, Deputy Mayor?
I'll go first. Yes.
Okay,
Thank you, Chairman. Good afternoon, Chairman Mendelson, members of the Committee of the Whole, staff, members of the public. My name is Paul Kine, and I'm honored to serve as the Deputy Mayor for Education for the District of Columbia. And thank you very much for the opportunity to testify today on the District of Columbia Public Schools school budgets for fiscal year 2024. In school budget development, which began in August, we are implementing the revised DCPS school budget model for the second year. As you know, this model was developed over years with technical expertise from staff and outside partners. Through the DCPS budget model, we are directing more of our funds according to student need and thereby advancing equity, enabling greater principal autonomy and stabilizing schools even through declining enrollment. We look forward to sharing initial budgets with school communities shortly. From there, the budgets will be revised based on school community feedback for the final submissions. This year, we faced a few unique circumstances in finalizing these budgets, which account for the delay in submitting school budgets to school communities and the council. For one, the Washington Teachers Union contract was finalized and transmitted to council in January. This historic contract, which significantly increases teacher compensation, must be accounted for in the school budgets. In addition, the Office of the Chief Financial Officer's December revenue projections showed no change from September, which is forcing some very difficult conversations about the budget overall and the education budget specifically, which represents approximately 20% of the district's total budget. We are working hard this year, as in prior years, to drive as many resources to our public schools as possible. In our development of this year's school budgets, we face a series of trade-offs. Our priorities remain prioritizing funding for students who need it the most. These are students classified as at risk, students in schools with high concentrations of poverty, English language learners, and students who receive specialized education services. We believe schools serving higher need populations should receive proportionally more funds. Budgets are statements of priorities, and we stand by these values. As discussed with this body, while we appreciate the council's intent to promote school stability, a value we absolutely share, we do have serious concerns about the school's first approach from a policy and practical perspective. At a high level, the school's first approach bill requires that school budgets increase irrespective of actual enrollment and student need, unless an enrollment decline justifies a classroom or subject level staff reduction. This approach essentially requires DCPS to prioritize stability over equity and ties the hands of our largest local education agency when our other 69 LEOs exercise broad autonomy to use their budgets in the best interest of the community. Moreover, legislating a budget process for a government agency may be seen as going beyond traditional council oversight and has real implications for DCPS, our public schools, and our overall public education budget. Moreover, as Chancellor Farabee will share, fully implementing the school's first emergency measure is not a simple task, as terms and provisions need to be defined, developed along with business rules in order for a new budget model to be in place. I'm glad the DCPS and council staff are working together to discuss the implementation details of this bill. All that being said, we are working hard this year to provide stability to schools irrespective of enrollment in a fiscally responsible way, as much in keeping with the school's first vision as possible. Thank you for the opportunity to testify, and I look forward to continuing the conversation when school budgets are released, and of course, taking questions today.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor. Chancellor?
Good afternoon, Chairman Mendelson, members of the council and staff. I'm Dr. Louis D. Farabee, Chancellor for DC Public Schools. Thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today about school budgets for the upcoming school year. For fiscal year 2024, DCPS is committed to funding initiatives to help our students recover from the academic, social, and emotional impacts of COVID-19. We know our public schools are key to the district's comeback. We look forward to releasing preliminary budgets to school communities this week, continuing the conversation with council, school principals, the local school advisory teams throughout the budget development process. DCPS revised budget model was developed based on feedback from our principal advisory board, parents, independent budget experts. Our model follows best practices from peer districts, put the needs of students first. Funds are distributed to schools based on a combination of student and staff counts, the needs of special student population, and a methodology designed to support year-over-year enrollment transition. Further, we will continue to make certain that no school loses more than 5% of their budget from one year to the next, regardless of shifts in enrollment. As an overview, funding is allocated to schools in 4 different categories. First category is student-based funding. Student-based funding is based on what we expect student enrollment count for the upcoming school year to be. This count is determined using historical enrollment data factors that affect enrollment, including housing developments, new schools, and grade level sizes matriculating through schools and feeder patterns. The second is staffing ratio allocation. In addition to student-based dollars, the model also includes funding allocation based on staff and faculty counts. These staffing ratios ensure that essential services, such as students receiving special education services and English language instruction, are resource adequate. The third is program grant allocation. On top of the student and staff-based dollars, the budget model incorporates funding allocations for supplemental program grants that are specific to school needs. And then finally, stability funding allocation. Our budget model is designed to provide schools with year-over-year stability funds. The safety net check stability dollars that are provided protect school budgets from the impact of fluctuating enrollment, ensure that schools can offer a baseline of general education services. Regarding stability, it is important to note that the fiscal year 24 budget for DCPS also provides additional funds to schools through the Mayor Recovery Fund, which is a 2-year commitment that began last year. The DCPS budget model is a balance of all of our values, including an important value that I know we all share as equity. One of our budget model cornerstones is to meet our equity imperative through the student-based funding for those who have greater need. This can include our students receiving special education services, English language learners, and those who are designated at risk for reasons such as financial need, experiencing homelessness, or being in the care of the district. When students need greater support, the school communities of which they are part of need greater funding to ensure that those needs are being met. To ensure stability, our budget must be responsive to the changing needs of our students over time and factoring in transition. With respect to partnership of our school leaders and the contribution of our local school advisory team to the budget process, the district prioritizes autonomy. We engage and empower our school leaders to make the best decisions about their students, staff, and community. DCPS remains committed to ensuring we drive as many resources to school as possible with a focus on transparency, stability, equity, and sustainability. We look forward to sharing our initial budget, gathering feedback from school communities to help them complete their fiscal year 24 budget. In regards to the School First and Budgeting Act, it is important to consider that the emergency version became law on January 11, 2023, a month before we plan to release next school year's budget, which began in developing last summer. As we shared with the council at public hearings on the bill and in subsequent meetings, it is neither feasible nor responsible to drastically alter our budgeting process in less than a month's time. Our common objective is to ensure adequacy and stability for our school community. However, there are several areas of the Act that present, as written, serious implementation challenges that cannot be thoughtfully resolved in this time for the year's budget. First, this bill creates a new January 1 point-in-time analysis for school budgets that is misaligned with our current budget cycle. DCPS begins to work well in advance of January with key activities taking place in the fall. DCPS current planning cycle leverages principal submitted budgets from the prior year, which are the budgets incorporated into the mayor's overall budget submission to the DC Council each spring. This practice, which is reliable and provides a firm foundation which budgets can be built, is supplying consistent, verifiable, and point-in-time reference. Second, The bill prescribes projected percentage increases in the uniform per student funding formula. At the foundation level is an inflationary option, but in this input, similarly not available at the analysis period that is required. Further, including this percentage as a core assumption of what schools must receive has a problematic circular nature. As the UPSF foundation level increases, the amount that schools need to be compliant with the law also increases, triggering another UPSF foundation level increase, inflating with each rotation. Additionally, there are undefined terms in the bill that require the establishment of clear business rules, as terms will have very large impact on school community. For instance, the bill states that DCPS may increase budgets as required by the school's projected or actual increases in 1 year over time. This language must be clearly defined and mirrored in the text for enrollment decline. School budgets are very complex. Budgeting is complex. For example, a school losing 20 first graders from 1 year to the next is straightforward, but the straightforward is very unlikely. Our model accounts for more complex scenarios, such as a school losing 20 10th graders across different subject areas. This bill is silent on the more complex and common scenarios and on the guidance of dual language schools, opportunity academies, and early childhood education centers, all of which have unique needs. Moreover, the bill does not provide a methodology for allocating staff beyond classroom teachers and does not account for changes in the overall student population and does not require full-time FTE increases and decreases. In the interim, DCPS updated budget model will address several of the intentions of the legislation language. Our model is designed to be responsive to the community feedback around year one implementation of the fiscal 23 budget and to build upon what we've worked on while making important refinements that better ensure adequacy and increase differentiated supports where they are needed the most. With our approach, teachers will be able to be stronger with their relationship with students by providing small group instruction and greater resources for students who have higher needs. In closing, DCPS is fully committed to the shared goals of stability, equity, and transparency. We want to work with the council to improve these commitments in the fiscal 24 budget and beyond. I'm happy to answer questions at this time.
Thank you, Chancellor Fairby. Thank you, Deputy Mayor Kine. I'm going to start with this question, and that should be on a 10-minute clock. Anybody can put me on a clock. Chancellor, in your statement on page 3, you said regarding stability, it's important to note that DCPS will provide additional funds to the mayor's recovery. How much money is available?
That allocation has not been issued to DCPS, and we have not finalized our budgets to schools, but we'll do so quickly in anticipation that schools will have their budgets this week to share with principals and local school advisory teams.
So theoretically, there could be zero money there because it hasn't been allocated.
We know that it will be an allocation in the Mayor's Recovery Fund. We don't have the exact number of that amount to share at this time.
Okay, so it could be a little or a lot. You don't know.
We don't have a number at this time.
So even though you say that DCPS will also provide additional funds to schools through the fund, you don't actually know how much is in it.
We don't have an allocation at this time. What we do know, Chairman, is this is a 2-year commitment. And schools found the resources through this funding stream to be very helpful in assisting them with their buying power and ability to provide resources to students and families accordingly. We anticipate the same will be true for fiscal 24 budget season as well.
You know the percentage increase of the uniform per student funding formula for next year?
We do not have the increase in the uniform per student funding for fiscal year 24.
Okay, so you are designing a budget for DCPS and you don't know you don't know what the funding, how the funding will change.
We have our structure of our model, but we don't have the inputs as relates to the uniform per student funding formula. And as you asked earlier, the Mayor's Recovery Fund. As I mentioned earlier, the Mayor's Recovery Fund, again, was extremely helpful to schools and their buying power. Fiscal year 23, it was slightly under $10 million that were allocated to school as a part of the Mayor's Recovery.
Okay, well, that speaks to the recovery fund. I'm asking about the UPSFF. So you don't know what the UPSFF increase will be.
We do not have that number
Okay.
today, Chairman.
But you have, I think you said the structure of your model so that when you know, you can just slip it right in.
That is correct.
Okay, so why doesn't that apply to the school's first approach?
Yes, so the school's first approach begins with a analysis of year over year. It's primarily, as we
Actually, it
understand,
doesn't. It begins with the current year budget.
exactly. It begins with
Not
what
an
the schools,
analysis of the current year budget.
it begins with what the schools received the year before.
And then you have to adjust it by the UPSFF.
Yes,
Which
but there's
you
some,
don't know, but then with your model, you don't know it either.
yes, but as I shared in my testimony, there are several undetermined terms in business rules that are not associated with our current structure that where we have very specific business rule
Okay,
and
so
terminology.
like what undefined term?
For example, the term general education, we have very specific business rule of how the term general education is utilized, what that reference. We also have additional resources that have been allocated to schools that we account for, as I said earlier, in our grants. And we did not see where there was a actual term or terminology around how we support our unique campuses, as I shared in my testimony, such as our opportunity academies.
Well, no, you're kind of getting away from the point about undefined term. So you said general education. You have a definition for general education, but you don't know what it is.
We have a definition in our
Okay.
current model what general education resources are.
Okay,
My point was that it is not clearly defined in the Budget Act. As
except
written.
you know what it is. The only one you mentioned in your testimony was the in 1 year or over time. So are there any other undefined terms?
Yeah, there are other terms, as I said earlier, we are specifically very concerned that it doesn't address some of our unique program options, as I mentioned earlier, as our opportunity academies, many of our programs that support students that have special needs. So for example, it speaks to students receiving special education services, but there's a wide range of special education services that DCPS provides to students. So for example, there may be a student receiving services for speech language, and then we may have a self-contained classroom
Well,
supporting
does the
students.
school's first bill say that you can't fund those programs?
There aren't business rules for how those programs are funded.
Okay, does the bill interfere with those business rules for how those programs are funded?
Well, we would need to have those business rules to apply the formula accordingly.
As I recall, the formula in schools first excludes from the formula special education. So how you fund special education now, you would continue to fund.
But there's specific language around FTEs and positions. And so
Yes.
our special education programming shifts year over year based on IEP needs of students and where students are assigned to their school and the types of services
Sure,
they're receiving.
But are you saying that the schools first requires you to cut that money?
Doesn't necessarily require us to cut that
No,
money,
not
but we don't actually
necessarily. Does it
know.
require you to cut that money?
We don't actually know what it requires. Actually, it's ambiguous of what it implies for that particular service.
Okay, so you read into that you have to cut it.
Well, again, it doesn't speak to how those resources are allocated. Again, the way that the language is presented, it is a top line application of how resources are going to be allocated to schools, but there aren't any underlying methodologies around how we would allocate those dollars specifically, and then terminology associated
So
with
top
particular
line means
categories.
that top line could also mean like bottom line, which is what's the total amount that the school get? Correct?
Well, I think the model may imply what a school may get in the top line, but we allocate those dollars to schools in very specific categories.
Does the bill speak to how you allocate them?
The bill may not speak to that specifically.
No, not may not, does it, or it doesn't? Actually, it doesn't.
I don't recall it speaking to that specifically, and I think that's
Let's
the
try it.
challenge.
It doesn't. So it says that if Hardy Middle School has a budget of 10 million this year, it has a budget of 10 million plus an inflationary factor next year, at least 10 million and an inflationary factor. It doesn't prescribe beyond that, so I don't understand how you allocate under that, which, by the way, I don't quite understand why you have to do, especially since one of you, I think you testified that that principal autonomy is very important. Give me a second here. Find that. The district prioritizes principal autonomy. That was page 3 of your statement, but be that as it may, I understand that you like to take the total budget for a school and then allocate it under that school. And just interrupt if I got it wrong. And the schools first law, it's a law, not a bill, doesn't speak to how you allocate. So you still have that freedom.
Yeah, but again, we allocate those dollars by underlining categories. And so it would be very confusing to provide schools with a budget that doesn't include that information.
You're free to do that. The bill doesn't prohibit you. So let me ask you this. Because the one undefined term that you mentioned in the statement, I'll say the only undefined term in the statement is the 1 year overtime. So tell me what part of this doesn't make sense. Add to the current budget additional funding to pay for additional teachers or other personnel if the school's enrollment has grown. Enrollment growth for the purpose of this calculation is not only this year compared to last 1 year's growth, but maybe cumulative growth over time. If a school grows by 50 students in 1 year, but the growth is spread equally over the 5 grades, that may not warrant additional teachers and therefore no additional funds. But if a school grows by 13 students, all in the same grade, 2 years in a row, that would be over time, that probably does warrant an additional teacher and therefore additional budget. All of this correlates to desired class size, which currently can be found in the collective bargaining agreement with Washington teachers. What part of that doesn't make sense?
But it only speaks to teachers. So for example, as a part of our budget allocation to schools, schools receive an allocation for custodial services, custodial staff.
Mhm.
And so there would be, as you described, there wouldn't be a reference point of those dollars that are dedicated specifically to custodial services and FTEs associated in that
Because you want to
category.
cut custodial staff?
It's not about cutting, it's just ensuring that schools have a clear picture of all the categories included within their budget.
The school's first law isn't about allocating within the total budget. It's about what the total budget is. So why does it matter? I mean, maybe you're planning on cutting custodial staff, although here, well, you would still have to do it within the total budget. I don't know of any, are there schools that have too many custodians? Spencer?
Well, that's something that we evaluate based on square footage, student population, and building. And so the point,
Well, wait a minute, do schools change in size from 1 year to the next?
schools do change based on renovation and modifications that we
Well,
make
yeah,
in
of
classroom
course, but
space.
putting that aside, do schools change in size? I thought schools are kind of like the same size from 1 year to the next. Why would you be changing custodial staff?
Well, custodial staff will change based on student population, sometimes when it grows, or may shift down, or there's a different use of the facility. And again, we have had significant
So
modernizations
does
and
the school's
renovations.
first law say you can't provide additional funding?
Yeah, I think there are many cases where we could go down a list of what it doesn't say. I think the challenge is those are the types of specifics that need to be included in our budget for schools to allocate their resources
What it
appropriately.
does say is what the minimum budget is for the school. So if you want more custodial staff, the law doesn't require you to have more custodial staff, but it also doesn't prohibit it if you want more custodial staff. All the law does is speak to the minimum budget. So I read this or you said this in your testimony. Our model accounts for more complex scenarios, such as a school losing 20 10th graders across different subjects. Why is it okay to cut a teacher if it's lost 20 10th graders across different subjects? That would be high school. The bill is silent on these more complex and common scenarios and on guidance for dual language schools, opportunity academies, and early childhood education centers. Moreover, the bill does not provide a methodology for allocating staff beyond classroom teachers and does not account for changes in overall student population needs that do not require full-time FTE increases and decreases. When I heard that, I thought, why is it okay to be cutting a school? So I guess that's what I asked a minute ago. A school has 2 janitors, custodial staff. And I will bet you go to that school and they will say they don't have enough custodial staff to maintain the building. So why are we even talking about cutting janitors?
I'm not talking about cutting custodial services.
well,
I'm
what
speaking
about
to
the-
a specific allocation category.
What about the subject teachers? If a school loses 20 10th graders across 5 subjects, that's 4 in each subject. Why is it okay to cut a teacher?
Well, it depends on the number of students that are assigned to that particular course at the secondary.
You mean like according to the CBA agreement?
No, for example, there may be more students that are required to express interest in calculus 2. Or there may be less or
Doesn't
more
the
students in
CBA agreement
English.
say that you ought to have, I think it's like 1 teacher for every 25 students?
Yes, so there are
I'm sorry, did you say yes?
class size information and protocols within the CBA with the Washington teacher. Well, the
Yeah.
point I'm making is that it isn't always clean at the secondary level or at the elementary level of how students may transition from one grade to the next or one course to the next that would impact the number of students in the classroom and also impact staff.
Well, but we're not talking about clean here. We're talking about cutting staff. Why is it okay to cut a teacher just because classroom size went from 26 to 22?
So let me give you an example where we would need to make a change in staff. So for example, middle school that has grades 6, 7, and 8. They have a population of 8th graders that are graduating, leading, going to high school. They have a new group of rising 6th graders that are coming in from elementary. That shift in population may bring additional students that have additional needs. Maybe more English language learners, maybe less English language. Maybe more students receiving special education services, maybe less students receiving special education services.
Sure.
All those factors would drive the personnel needed to support those students accordingly, which may mean a school may have more resources or more need. Or there may be students in the building that have less need that would drive resources down.
You mentioned special ed and ELL. Okay, so does the bill prevent you from cutting ELL?
Well, again, it's not
No,
clear.
that's a yes or no. Does the bill prevent you from cutting ELL?
It doesn't speak to it, so it's not
Actually, it
clear.
does. You've read the bill, actually it does. It's paragraph 7. Section 104. I believe it's subsection B. Nope, it might be subsection A. Subsection A, paragraph 7. Yellow.
I don't have that in front of me, so you would have to reference specifically what stated.
I'm just telling you, it speaks to ELL. I believe it speaks to special education.
What we've seen in review, Chairman, it does not provide the level of specificity in which we allocate those resources.
Well, I know this, that, you know, at my initiative, I met with you and your staff, and there was more interest on your part in asking for delay of the law than there was in discussing the provisions. But you did mention then about the inability to understand what we meant by in 1 year or over time, and I explained it. I'm explained it again. It's actually in the committee report. That's what I read. So, you know, my takeaway was that you and your folks weren't really interested in understanding.
That's unfortunate because we agreed to meet, and had several conversations with you and your team about how the
I
model.
believe there were two. The second meeting I kind of had to insist on because there was resistance to it. And I excused myself from that, and you excused yourself from that. And my understanding is still, it wasn't much more productive. So these terms, for instance, they're undefined, are explainable. All this bill is about, this law is about, is coming up with a minimum budget for school. The bill is explicit that if you want to provide more, you can. It says that explicitly, but even if it didn't say that explicitly, you can provide schools more. You need more special ed, you can provide more. They need more custodians, you can provide. Need more reading specialists, you can provide more. You cannot find a line in the bill that says you can't do that. But there is, the bill is quite clear that the cutting a school is not okay. So there also was in your testimony, Chancellor, this statement: our model is designed to be responsive to the community's feedback around year one implementation of the FY23 budget. And when I heard that, I have to say that the only responsiveness I heard from DCPS following last year's implementation of the model was denial. Denial that, for instance, Hardy School was cut. They laid off 5 teachers, I believe, but they were not cut. And I heard that regarding school after school. I think Ketchum was another. What was the elementary school? I wrote you a letter about it.
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly a large number of schools that have a high need student population that receive significant more funding. So I think about a school, for example, Columbia Heights Education Campus.
Yes, the high schools generally did pretty well last.
This school has high concentration of students with need, English language learners. I am confident Principal Takeva would share that ability to have those additional resources to meet the needs of the student population was extremely helpful.
Your testimony in the past has been that no school saw a reduction in their budget. Correct?
Yeah, so I think it's
Was that yes?
important. I think it's, so let me clarify, it's important to look at point in time. So we have had situations where we have held schools harmless to their previous year budget, but there's also been one-time funding infused into schools' budgets as well. So I think when we
I'm not
start to talk
interested in the
about,
source, whether it's one time or not. I believe it's been your testimony, and I think you just said yes, that schools did not see any reductions in their budget.
but there may be scenarios in which one-time funding is not included because again, it is one-time funding. I think there's
So
some
then they
confusion.
did, some schools did see a reduction in their budget.
It is possible.
Okay, all right, I won't go any further. I didn't understand this, like the bill creates a new January 1st point in time analysis for school budgets that's misaligned with our budgets. I don't get that.
My understanding is that we are using inflationary numbers that are typically issued in January to determine how school budgets will be funded.
Oh, you mean like the UPSFF?
That is correct.
Yeah, okay, well, you don't even know that now, and today's February 13th.
That is correct.
Okay. January 1st, though, only refers to what the school's current budget. You do know that.
Yeah, but again, if we're even looking at where we are or where we were in January, I think it would be a disservice to principals, schools, and local schools advisory teams to overhaul school budgets in that short period of time between now and February.
I'm over at my time, I see. Councilmember Freeman, do you have any question?
Thank you very much, Chairman Mendelson. Yes, I do have some questions, and thank you, Chancellor Farabee and Deputy Mayor Kine for testifying today. I have a kind of big picture question to start out, and I wonder, for both Chancellor Farabee and Deputy Mayor Kine, do you think that any of our DCPS schools were overfunded in the current year?
Well, when it comes to our students and our youth, I mean, there's never enough resources. That's the reality. But the reality also is we don't have infinite amount of resources. I think our challenge is, and will be going forward, is we have a significant amount of infusion of one-time resources that we know won't be available to us in the coming years. And I think that will be felt in some way as those resources are phased out of our budgets, and those resources may not exist in the same way for schools.
And Deputy Mayor Kine, do you share that view?
Yeah, I mean, I'll add, thank you for the question. I think it's a very, very important one. And I think it gets to the heart of some of the conversation we're having. And that is, we recognize we would love to give, in some senses, unlimited resources to our city's children. And we've got to make these decisions in the context not only of the school's budget and the public school funding, which is 20% of the overall city budget, but also in the context of the overall city. These are all trade-off conversations. And we, in the executive, are responsible for determining our own answers to those trade-offs based on the values and priorities that we work with residents to set. And then we hand that budget over to, once the mayor has made her decisions, to council to determine whether it agrees with the trade-offs and priorities that we've put forward.
So I actually, do think that's the fundamental thing that's going on here. And I have to say, I don't envy you, Chancellor Farabee, because here we are, you're talking about getting budgets out this week to schools, but you don't know what the increase in the UPSFF is, and you don't know how much of the mayor's funds are going to come. And so the budgets that you generate are going to be defined by how much the mayor gives you, not by an assessment of what schools need. Tell me why that is. I think you just acknowledged that that is the case, that if you had more money, you would know how to use it. And you're going to be driven by the choices that are made this week about how much to raise the UPSFF and how much to put in from the mayor's fund. Is that unfair?
I'd actually like to just jump in if I could and just push back in a very, very respectful way, council member. It's not the case that any individual person makes an arbitrary decision and that determines the budgets. This is a very, very collaborative back and forth process with school communities and schools and agency directors. And so it is the case that no final determination has been made that we can share today. That's not unusual. We actually don't often share details about our developing budgets with council until the budget is delivered to council. But it is the case that we are paying attention to what we believe schools need, and we're listening to schools and the chancellor in order to make those determinations.
So, and I hear you, and I accept the respectful response, but I have a hard time imagining, and this goes to some of the things that the chairman was saying, that any of our school communities said to you, we need fewer adults under our roof. We have too much. And so if anything, I would think if there's a collaborative process with the schools, you would be hearing from schools about the additional things that they want to get. And then if there are cuts, in real cuts in terms of buying power, that would reflect a fiscal decision. That was a hard decision. You acknowledged it, Deputy Mayor Kine, that that the administration is in a tricky position because it has to figure out how much it can afford. But what it can afford won't necessarily be what it perceives it can afford to devote to this function won't necessarily be the amount that's needed to meet the needs of the kids. I could put a question mark on it, but I think you get the point. I mean, one of the things that I have stressed for years is that I think this process is flipped on its head. And I worry a little. I mean, the chancellor talks about all the internal formulas that DCPS uses, but we know formulas break down. You know, at Jackson Reed, class sizes are giant. And at many of the schools in Ward 3, we have very, very high class sizes, and yet they're only held up by what's called one-time funding. So the formulas break down. I worry about an overlay of yet another formula through the school's first act, where this really should be starting. If education really is our priority, is to start with an assessment of people's need and then build the budget up from there. But that isn't what happens here. So I'll pivot it to a question, and then I'll let my colleague Councilmember Henderson speak. If we share the view that schools are not overfunded today, and actually, if you had more money, you would probably want to spend it. I suspect, Chancellor Farabee, if there are real buying power cuts in any school, will you lay out specifically what justified those cuts so that school communities can see it?
Yeah, so I think it's important to know that, you know, a lot of the conversation today has been based on what the school maybe had the year before and what they have next year without accounting for student need. Our budget model is driven by a equity imperative that we provide funding per student basis that includes additional weighted dollars for students that have greater need. And so, you know, I gave the example about the middle school that had a changing population year over year. And I think it's important as we look at school budgets year over year to also look at their student population and how the needs of those student populations change. And it may be that they have more students that have greater need, and it'd be expectation that those resources follow the student. But it also may mean at the same time that there may be some schools that have less need based on their student population than the year before. And I believe that they should also in that scenario be funded accordingly. And so I think if we look at year over year, there are complexities associated with the student population and the need that drives school funding.
And I actually 100% agree with that, Chancellor Farabee. I think, and I've spent a decade and a half advocating, despite the fact that I live in Ward 3, my children went to Ward 3 schools, that it is critical that we fund the schools with the greatest needs fully, and that the schools in communities other than my own have greater needs, and we need to acknowledge that. I couldn't share that view more. But where the reason I asked up front is, were any of our schools overfunded, is because I don't think they were. And I don't think the schools in my community were, I don't think the schools anywhere were. And it may be that there are changes in schools that you could say, this is why we cut a teacher here, or this is why we made a reduction. And if there are reductions, and I really hope there are not in buying power, I really think that in this year as we're coming out of COVID, as we had the devastating park scores last year, that we push on and fully invest in all of our schools. Where you're eroding buying power, I hope you'll spell out very clearly why it is you think that's justified, because where there's an erosion of buying power, there is not a single parent in a DCPS school who thinks their school is overfunded, and they're going to push you on it, and I'm going to push you on it. And so I think I hope it doesn't come down to, well, we just didn't have enough money, because if we talk about education as being such a high priority, we need to invest in it as if it were. So thank you very much.
Chairman, can I just make one very brief observation?
Yes.
Based on that, and apologies. Councilmember Freeman, I think that's a very important point. I'd also share that it's important, I think, collectively, that we're actually not dismissive of the idea that some of this funding has been one time, which the chancellor shared earlier. We had $300 million in ESSER funding that actually went into and around schools. I don't think across any of our ARPA or recovery funding from the federal government, there was the idea that we would make up for it all local dollars. And so part of the conversation, whether we like it or not, when we look at the actual school budgets, is going to be what happened to school budgets based on the recovery dollars we were able to put in, and how as a city, we simply cannot afford to sustain them. I just wanted to note that based on the exchange on one.
Well, I mean, as you do that, then you also have to defend anything else you're doing with other dollars as to why it is that you're making if you make a reduction here, if you make a reduction in buying powers, you have to defend it in the face of all the other things that you're out there doing. So I'll stop and let the next person take their turn. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Councilmember. I do want to note for the record that the Schools First Law does exclude CSR funding. Councilmember Henderson?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon, Chancellor Fairley and Deputy Mayor Klein. I'll just sort of jump right in. I listened to your testimonies and admittedly was a little confused about why we were having this hearing, since I knew that the budgets hadn't been out yet. So let's talk about the current timeline. Chancellor, you keep saying this week. Do we have a day this week?
I do not have a specific date this week. We will work to get out as quickly as possible. We know that schools are eager to receive that information, and we want to ensure that principals and local school advisory teams have the appropriate time to respond to their budgets.
Okay, so on average, so LSATs will have about how much time?
We typically give the principals a preview of the budget before it goes directly to the local school advisory teams. Once the principal preview, it goes to the local school advisory team. They're anywhere from, I would say, 3 to 4 days of review time, depending upon the day of the week and the weekend.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's an opportunity for the advisory team to submit their budget request to us as well, and their initial budget for review. And once that is complete, there's a review time period before budgets are finalized. And then once budgets are finalized, they're submitted as part of the mayor's overall budget to council.
Okay, so the school budgets, once they are released, will include the allocation for ARPA funds as well?
Can you repeat
Or-
that question, Councilmember Henderson?
When the school budgets go out, it will also include whatever the new year FY24 allocation is for ARPA or ESSER funds?
It will.
Will those be on-
There will be some allocation of dollars that go directly to schools, and then there will also be some indirectly. It's also important to note that we have already asked schools to submit their acceleration plans for next school year and over the summer. And they've identified requests that they would need in order to execute on those strategies and
Mhm.
high impact tutoring. And so we have already built that into our budget. Schools know what those allocations are and have already started planning for that work.
Okay. There used to be a DCPS budget guide that went out with school budgets. Will that also be part of this year?
Yes, so with each allocation of the budget, we provide a pocket guide, a budget guide that provides the community a transparent view of all the funding streams
Mhm.
that in the school's budget, as I mentioned earlier, and that will be available to the community when the budgets are released to schools.
Okay. You mentioned in your testimony, Chancellor, a quote unquote updated budget model. What do you mean by that?
Right, so fiscal year 23 was our first year of the implementation of our our new model, which included a per student allocation structure where we allocated a base amount of funding for each student and then additional weighted dollars based on need. And we will continue to refine that as we go into fiscal year 24 based on the feedback that we received.
Okay, so is there any part of the school's first budgeting bill that you all are implementing this school year?
So I think
And I'm saying this recognizing the challenges in terms of timeline. I can appreciate you saying, you know, right, like the bill asks for January 1 point in time. You all obviously start the budgeting process before then. But if we think about some of the elements of the bill, so for instance, it requires that the budget be allocated amongst central, local schools, school support, and school-wide. That seems like a fairly simple implementation task, no?
Yeah, I mean, I think what's defined in those categories are not clear. And I think it would be a significant shift from where we are today. And so, for example, our budget narratives that go with each school's budget would need to be overhauled and look completely different. And so I think the time to make those shifts did not exist. I think our commitment, as I started with my testimony, to stability year over year is something that we share and will be reflected in the budgets that schools receive. And we know at a minimum, no school will have less than 5% what they had in prior year budget.
Well, yeah, I mean, that was a law that was passed several years ago. So I know at least for that part, that is going to be the case in terms of the stabilization piece. I guess I'm trying to...
Yeah, the other part of that is in addition to that, we do what we call a safety net check. And so that also reviews the school's budget to ensure that the baseline services the school needs to operate, support students and families, all those resources are within the school budget. And so if there's a gap, we fill that gap to ensure that the schools have the appropriate FTEs or dollars.
Okay. Will the budgets that are being released this week, and I know we're talking semantics here because I heard you say, oh, we released the principals. So I guess the better question is, will the public school communities see school budgets this week?
That is the plan, that the public will see school budgets this week.
Okay. Will the budgets this week include the pay raises for all the bargaining units that have been agreed to thus far?
Yeah, so great question. I think Deputy Mayor spoke to the complexities of executing on the Watchers Teacher Union contract as a part of this budget cycle. School leaders and local school advisory teams will not have to account for that. That will not be a part of their process. It will be.
But they're not the only ones, though. I'm talking about the principals. I'm talking about AFSCME.
All of the new contracts will not be a part of the work of the advisory teams. We always use average salary, and so that is baked into our assumptions. The additions of those contracts will not be contemplated in what schools receive in their initial budgets.
So we should expect to see those when the budgets are submitted to the council?
Yeah, so at some point when the mayor submits the budget to council, there'll be a reflection of that. It's important to note, for example, for the Washington Teachers Union contract, and also the school resource officers, the school officers, I should say, a lot of that compensation is retroactive.
Right.
And so most of that compensation is backward facing compared to forward facing.
Okay. I guess what I'm trying to get at is, for those of us who are paying attention to the ins and outs of the CBAs, we recognize that even for FY23, well, for the contracts that are still going to be current, that there's a certain amount of increase that's going to be taken up. And what I don't want from a public narrative is for you all to say, oh, we increased the budgets for DCPS by X amount, when in reality, we know that much of that raise is going to salary agreements. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it is understood.
It's kind of like we are playing a little chess game here of, again, semantics, right? It's about the narrative. So you say, oh, we increased CPS's budget by 7%, when in fact, if we tally up the increases from AFSCME, WTU, and Council of School Officers, there's your 7% increase right there.
Yeah, we'll continue to work with the city's budget team to ensure that all the financing of the collective bargaining agreements are addressed without schools having to contemplate that and how they assign resources based on their school allocation.
Okay. Let's talk about Duke Ellington really quickly, since we had some of those students who were before the council this morning. I've read the 1.5 reports. I haven't got all the way through the second one. Is what you all sent in January finalized
We have
in terms of
not,
your plan for school year 23-24?
haven't been any final determinations. We submitted our proposal. Believe Duke Ellington in the process of submitting their proposal in response to ours. But there are a number of different aspects of operations that are considered that in addition to funding. But it's,
Okay, so what will their school budget that comes out this week reflect if there's no agreement that's finalized?
right, so it will reflect the regular allocation that we allocate to schools, and then the grants that are associated with operating their arts program, similar to other special school grants that are allocated to schools that have unique programming.
Okay. I will say this, and thank you, Chancellor, for answering my questions, and Deputy Mayor Kine for being here as well. I've always thought it's kind of how we do school budgeting is always kind of backwards, because in the rational sense is that we would see the UPSFF chart worksheet, and then we would work on school budgets, because then everybody would know what the increase is. But we do it sort of in the reverse, which I think puts us at a bit of a disservice, but also from a transparency standpoint, it hurts in that way. I know I'm over time, although, Mr. Chairman, you are like 11 minutes over, but I'm gonna let it.
That's because you're a better person than me. So the two reports on Ellington from DCPS and from the Ellington community are both available on the council's website. If if anybody goes to the council's website, clicks on legislation and whatever it's called, legislation, and then in the search writes Ellington, the reports will come up. One was filed January 30th and the other was filed, posted on the website on January 18th. So you can sort by date, by Ellington, and the public can get the reports that way. Thank you, Councilmember. Councilmember Bonds?
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you very much. And thank you, Deputy Mayor and Chancellor. I'm trying to be clear as to what I'm hearing today. The testimony that I'm looking at from Chancellor indicates a program where you are saying that the allocation of funds to the schools will be in 4 different categories. And so I'm trying to understand what we thought we were talking about today, which is the Schools First Budgeting Amendment Act. And so I want to understand if the interpretation of your interpretation, Mr. Chancellor, is that the Schools First Budgeting Act is divided into these 4 components that you have identified, the categories: school-based funding, staffing ratio allocations, program grant allocations, and stability funding allocations. Is that your interpretation of the School First Budgeting Amendment Act?
Thank you, Councilmember Bonds. I mean, there's several points that we've discussed today in terms of categories and terminology that is in the act that is very different than we currently allocate resources. And there's specific language about how schools can lose and gain FTEs. What I was pointing out today, that there's much more complexity in those positions that we believe is not accounted for. But overall, don't believe that it's reasonable to make a transition in our budget model for fiscal year 24 based on the time period in which the act was approved, which is in January, and to overhaul and redesign our budget model to get budgets out to schools this month, which is scheduled to happen this week.
Okay, I think I was following along with that, and that's why I wanted to ask this question of you. You said in your testimony, we will continue to make certain that no school loses more than 5% of their budget from one year to the next, regardless of shift in enrollment. And so when I read that, and I read our Schools First and Budgeting Amendment Act, they don't quite come together. And that's why I wanted to examine, if I might, what you believe you're doing in order to be compliant with the law, which is Schools First and Budgeting Amendment Act.
Yeah, so in the testimony, I did share that as a part of our model, no school will receive less than 5% of what they had the year before, so they have 95% of their previous year budget. But overall, in summary, Councilmember Bonds, just don't believe that it is appropriate at this point, nor at the time, to make a dramatic shift in our budget model, given the short time period between once the act was approved and then when we would implement the act and then issue budgets to the schools.
Okay, so then are you of the opinion that we now have the law on the books, that the law needs to be amended so that it comes into reality, let's say in FY24, in FY25 maybe? Is that your testimony?
Yeah, we're committed to continue to work with council on what was passed by the council. But again, just don't believe that there is reasonable time to execute on the model for fiscal year 24.
Okay, so what would be your timeline? Tell me your timeline.
Well, I don't have a specific timeline for fiscal year 24 because we're in the middle of that right now. We're going to get budgets to schools this week. As we've done in the past, as Chairman Mendelson referenced, we have had with him in his budget office, and we're committed to continue to have those meetings on a regular basis to ensure that we continue to move towards compliance with the law.
All right, so this year it will be 95% and it will be based on these categories. Am I correct?
Yeah, so again, we allocate in a number of combinations of positions, and then we also have what we call flexible funding as well. And again, what we're sharing there, Councilmember Bond, is that we believe that it would be very challenging and difficult for school communities to digest the budget and to make that transition given the amount of time we had to make those adjustments.
Okay, so for this year, the formula payment for a school that received $1,000 in FY23, this year they'll get 95% of the 1,000, and then they'll have the overlay of other dollars like special education services, English language learners, for those who are experiencing homelessness and those that are in the care of the district, and the designated at-risk monies. Is that correct?
Yes, those categories that you just referenced is assumed in that 95%.
But it's in the 95%.
Right.
That's what I was trying to discover. Thank you.
But in addition to the check for the 95%, we also have what we call a safety net check to ensure that the school has the appropriate resources, and we may provide additional resources beyond that. It's important to note, Councilman Bond, that there's really 3 reasons in which a school will see a dramatic shift. And that is if a school is experiencing programmatic changes, there's changes in the need in their student population, And then there's shifts in enrollment, whether the school is increasing enrollment or decreasing in enrollment.
All right, and so of the $1,000, back to that, and the 95%, which now includes these other categories. While the school gets 95% of the $1,000, how much goes to central administration?
Yeah, so central administration is approximately 3% of our budget. But the majority of that is in support services that go directly to school. So for example, the team that supports curriculum development for our schools, or the team that supports special education services. Those are the additional resources that are applied to schools via our central services team. And again, to be clear, Councilmember Bond, the 95% I want to be clear about is the minimum allocation that schools would receive.
Yeah, but you told me that this allocation is going to include all these special needs that a school has. So in other words, the formulas that many of us think means that a school will not receive less money is really it's a summary of the school receiving various monies based on different formulas for different services that are provided. Yeah, am I correct?
Yeah, so the minimum that a school will receive would be 95% of what they received the year before. What's included in all of that are all the resources that you described, and also schools can receive beyond that 95% based on student need or programmatic needs in the school as well, or if they're growing in enrollment as well.
Okay, and I understand all that. So what I'm trying to understand is these needs, growing enrollment, and what have you. So is there another formula that you implement in order to add to this 95% of this $1,000 based on enrollment, based on need? I don't know what need is. You haven't specified what that might be. I'm trying to understand how a school knows what it's going to get or what it can get, other than we all can understand enrollment, because we can see that, we can count the students. But I'm just trying to understand what it is that, why have we made the allocation of resources to our schools so complicated so that we end up with some schools of great need not getting what they need. For instance, my colleague, Councilmember Furman, mentioned the excess enrollment that is occurring at Jackson Reed. Okay, they're going to continue to grow. They're going to continue to grow, so that means they're going to get more money. They have to, based on what you're telling me. But a school that is struggling and maybe has more at risk, or let's say special education needs, they may not get any additional funding based on this formula that you're using. So I'm trying to understand that.
Yeah, so Councilman Bond, I would say if you look at the $1,000 that you're referencing, within that $1,000 is our formula of how schools receive dollars. And so it starts on the grants of allocation, and then we allocate positions for special education services, language services as well, custodial services. And then we also have what we call flexible dollars that are allocated to school on a per student basis. And there's a base number for that, each student. And then on top of that, we give additional dollars that are weighted for students based on students that are at risk, students receiving special education services, and also language. And so if you have a higher concentration of those student populations, which we know have greater need, you will receive more dollars for that student population in your building.
Okay, so then our schools first and Budgeting Amendment Act, basically, you're saying you cannot implement that. It's based on, because you have formulas that may dictate that you implement another funding process. I thank you very much, Chancellor. I understand clearly now. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Councilmember Bonds. Councilmember Parker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Councilmember Bonds asked several of the questions that I wanted to ask. Deputy Mayor Kine, Chancellor Fairbury, it's great to see you. I'm going to start with you, Deputy Mayor Kine. I think the subtext to a lot of what we're talking about is the reality that we have too many schools in the district. And we're continuing to try to split a finite amount of money into smaller, and ever smaller pieces. And the challenging job that you all have is to come here and justify it. What efforts have you taken to have greater coordination across LEAs, namely our charter sector, so that we don't keep having these same debates around splitting the pool of money in infinite smaller ways?
Thank you for the question, Councilmember. Good to see you. I think you're asking a very important question. I'm not sure that everyone who's a family member, parent in the city feels like we have too many schools. As you know, our vision for public education in the city is that we have a strong set of neighborhood public schools that parents can opt into, complemented by citywide schools, which are run either by DCPS or any of the other 67 or so LEAs. Currently, 25% of children attend their neighborhood school and 75% choose other schools that are citywide in nature, both DCPS and charter. So I'm not sure we could necessarily agree as a city that we have too many. At the same time, I do think we have to be very conscious of the size of our schools. And we want to make sure that we don't have too many, let me say, small schools across the city, because that can indeed lead to costs that we might not choose to bear. And I think that's what you're implying as a city. So we have done an extraordinary amount of work to coordinate with the Public Charter School Board, with DCPS, with LEAs on a number of important initiatives, including taking a look at how we can determine our need for any additional schools that we might have.
Do you think we have too many schools in the district?
Right now, I don't think we have too many schools. I think it's critically important that we continue to ensure our neighborhood schools are strong. So in that sense, I don't think we have too many neighborhood schools. I think families would love to ensure they could send their kids to schools close to home. Not everyone in the city believes that they can. So I think there's a question on the table about our neighborhood school portfolio, and that's, do we have enough of them?
Well, I will say, I think we have too many schools. I think a lot of people would agree with that. There is a difference, as you know, in the number of schools versus the quality of school. I would agree with you that many parents would agree the quality of our schools are not at the level that their children deserve. Full stop. I'm thinking of the letter that you sent to the charter board some years ago, essentially suggesting, hey, we should be more thoughtful around continuously opening new schools. And that is the spirit with which I'm asking, because while I appreciated that letter, and I think at that time you had a very strong rebuke from the charter sector, the question still remains, what are we doing for there to be coordination to improve quality of our schools so that we do not feel the need to continue to onboard new schools?
Yeah, I'm happy to report a couple very quick things on that, Councilmember. The first is there was a strong rebuke from some portions of the charter sector, but not all. And the Charter School Board, as you, I'm sure, are very aware, in its process now of looking for applications for any new schools, has implemented an entirely new standard for what they describe as a needs-based assessment. And I think that comes directly from the work that we've been doing together as a city to coordinate and look at, if there are any new schools to open, what specific needs are they filling? And I think that's a sign of real progress in the direction I think you were suggesting.
Yes, thank you for that. Chancellor, I'm going to turn to you. regarding specific questions on the budget. So I was shocked to hear that you are not aware of the increase, if there will be an increase in the UPSFF. That is my understanding, right?
Correct. We do not have the UPSFF at this time.
But school budgets will be released this week.
That is the plan,
And
correct?
so will you learn about the increase, potential increase before school budgets are released?
Yes, so the UPSFF will be applied to our budget. When that occurs, then we're able to produce the budgets that go to schools and local school advisory.
So this week, budgets will be released, but before that, at some point, you will be made aware of the increase in the UPSF.
That is correct.
Got it. I will also say, and I say this understanding that it may not be a unilateral decision, that I'm a bit troubled that it seems that DCPS is just deciding which rules they're going to follow. That's what it appears to me as a new council member. We're just here about procurement issues. And it seemed clear that DCPS was skirting outside of the rules. And this is another example where it seems like DCPS is saying, well, we don't really like that, so we're not going to follow that. That's less a question, more of an observation that I'm hoping that through stronger collaboration, we can improve over time. When those budgets are released, and this is something that Councilmember Bonds was getting at, you said 3% of the overall budget would be allocated to central office. Is that correct?
Yes, so it's actually below 3%. It's actually 2.7%. And so that is the administrative services that supports we provide. So there are a number of compliance positions, human resource functions also fall in that category. The second largest category then is our school support. So these are individuals that are held off school budgets centrally, but they support schools directly. Then there's the school budget, which is in about 84% of our school budget.
And a large part of that, I know, are contracts with the school district, whether it be assessments, vendors, et cetera. You have a ballpark of what percentage that makes of the central office budget?
Yeah, I couldn't give you that today. It fluctuates.
Okay.
The number of contracts that schools implement on, and then also centrally, we also have a number of contracts as well that changes.
One of the things that has been a pain point are discretionary positions. And you know, there's been a lot of discussion around librarians, and then it wasn't made a discretionary position. Can you share which positions will be discretionary in this year's budget?
Yeah, so that information will go to schools as a part of their budget of what's flexible, what's not flexible. Our plan is to continue with our same status as it relates to school librarian in terms of being a protected position. That is done to ensure that there are core services that are consistent across schools and balancing the desire for expanding autonomy as well.
Yep.
And it's something that we review annually. There are scenarios in which schools can make requests for position adjustments that reviewed by their supervisors, then a decision is made in terms of how those positions are.
Are there any positions that were required last year that will be discretionary this year? And if so, which?
I don't anticipate significant changes in those categories for the fiscal 24 year.
So schools should not see changes in positions made discretionary.
Yeah, I don't anticipate much change.
Okay. Immigrant students coming to the district, and we know that there has been an ongoing crisis with the publicity stunts from governors in the South. I know many Ward 5 schools have received students, namely a school like Langdon. In what ways will the budget account for these students and the support that they need? Because what I've heard this year is that many of our schools have absorbed these students, yet have not received additional funds, supports, instructional materials to accommodate the need that these students have.
All right, so there's two ways in which we support schools. So we have an enrollment reserve that is designed to be infused in schools when needs change during the school year. As the system of right, we accept students all throughout the school year, and sometimes needs to change accordingly. But we had unique situations and scenarios this year. And so we provided those resources to schools accordingly. Second way that happened, and I'm glad you asked that question, because at the center of our model is this great sense of equity and ensuring that we just don't allocate dollars to school based on amount of what you got last year, but it's based on the needs of the students in the building. And so because of that, when schools see a dramatic increase in language learners, we account for that with the additional weights that are provided to schools to get more dollars to support those schools that we know have greater need based on that population. So those are the two ways in which schools would receive additional resources.
Mr. Chairman, could I have 60 more seconds?
Sure.
So in the budget narratives, will it be spelled out which schools are receiving additional funds for immigrant students?
So in the budget narrative, it will include information about their weighted dollars. We won't specifically call out immigrant families.
Got it. And then last thing in my remaining 30 seconds, SROs, public safety, security personnel, that had been once covered by central office and then put on the schools. What will be the approach this year in this year's budget?
Yeah, so they won't see that. That'll be covered centrally.
That will be covered centrally.
Correct.
And will that adhere to the drawdown of SROs in schools?
Yes, it is aligned to the drawdown of SROs.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember. Councilmember Allen?
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chancellor, Deputy Mayor Kine, and others that are there. I am just jumping into the hearing, so it's possible that some of the questions I asked may have been discussed earlier, so apologies in advance on that. But based on the conversation I heard, the school budgets are going to be submitted this week. Is that correct, Chancellor?
That is the plan, is to issue budgets to schools this week.
Okay. And when will they be, when do you expect school LSATs to have their responses back to you?
Depending upon when they're issued, we give them a couple of days to get that back to us, depending upon the day of the week and the weekend. So once we release the budget to schools, we will share with them the time and period in which they're expected to get it back.
Okay. School's closed next week, isn't it?
There's February recess, but staff continues to work during that time period. But we also will be sensitive to that and provide time after February break as needed.
Okay, so it's not a couple of days then. So it will be, in other words, schools will all have at least 1 week. If they're getting their budgets this week and they're going to have time after the February recess break, they would have until the following week to get back to you?
It just depends on when it's allocated. We have not set a specific timeline, but we typically ensure that schools have several days to review.
Okay, but I'm trying to get a definitive answer here. The responses will not take place. Responses will not be required during February break, or they will?
We don't have a specific timeline to share at this point. We will likely ensure, just depending upon when they're issued, have some time period after February break in which they will have the ability to work on their budgets, but we haven't set a schedule yet.
Let me jump in for a second. So Chancellor, earlier in this hearing, you said LSATs would have 3-4 days, I think you said. Then you said to Councilmember Allen, 2 days, couple days. You said, quote, couple. Then you said 7 days. This is a bit problematic for us.
Yeah, I don't recall 7 days.
Well,
but-
Mr. Chairman, that's what I'm trying to get to, Chancellor, is that if they are, let's assume Friday, that they, we need a full week and schools are going to receive their budgets by the end of this calendar week, Friday, for example. And I'm hearing you say you recognize that there's going to have to be some additional time due to the February break. So they would be due sometime that following week. So that's at least 7, 8, 9, 10 days until Monday, correct? That's what I'm trying to make sure I understand. I've already got school communities contacting me asking, why haven't I seen a budget yet? I've got February break coming up. how am I supposed to get this back to you? That's what I'm trying to help avoid, and also give clarity to the school community so they know what the answer is, so they can plan around this.
Yeah, I don't have a timeline to share. If school budgets were to go out, tomorrow, schools would have the remainder of this week, perhaps maybe some time during February break, and then maybe some time thereafter, but I don't have, again, a specific timeline to share today.
Does that not seem odd that we wouldn't know that, though? I'm going to go talk to a bunch of school communities tonight. I know, and this is going to be one of the things they very pointedly asked me is what's the timing? How do we not know when the responses are due? I'm struggling with that.
Yeah, well, the timeline varies from year to year, and then there's years where we have February break, there's years that we don't have February break. But as soon as we have the allocations, we'll release those to schools and ensure that there's appropriate time for schools and local advisory teams to work on those budgets.
Okay. I guess I'll ask it for a third or fourth different way. So am I hearing you correctly that that appropriate timeline does not coincide with February break because an LSAT is going to, it's February break, school's out. So it's going to be the week after when it's due.
Yeah, so as I stated earlier, as soon as we release budgets to school, they will be provided with a timeline in which they're to respond.
Which will be the week after Feb break?
We will provide the timeline to schools when the budgets are released.
This seems
that's going to be a consistent response, Councilmember Allen. I understand the
lack of
interest.
consistency to the schools. I mean, I don't understand. How can this be so hard? We're going to release the budget sometime this week. That could be tomorrow. That could be Wednesday, Thursday, or Friday. Next week, school's closed, Feb break. And you also said you want to account for that and have a little extra time. Well, I don't understand the hesitancy to not say that's correct. They will be due back to us, those responses back Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, the week that everyone's back.
Again, we will provide a timeline to schools and LSATs when the budgets are ready.
Because
Councilmember, if I can just jump in here.
Deputy Mayor.
Yeah, I just want to share what the chancellor's not saying is that when the budgets are released are not entirely up to him. And so given the uncertainty around when we're doing it, and what we talked about earlier in the hearing was the complexity around developing the school budgets in the context of the city's broader budget. And a lot of that and those decisions are driving the school budgeting process. So I am not, by the way, disputing in any way school community's desire to know the timeline and to understand they're going to have adequate time to review the budgets. That's what the chancellor works on trying to do every year. We work with them on trying to do that. So I am very much in the spirit of your questioning. At the same time, because we don't know when school budgets are going to go to schools, it's hard to deliver a timeline that would be unsatisfying if we had to change it.
Right. I hear you. Thank you. And I definitely understand it's complex and it's complicated and it's hard. But so what I've heard is school budgets are going out this week. Could be, I guess, tomorrow, but could be up to Friday, but it's this week. Yes or no, that's correct.
That is the plan, is to release school budgets this week.
Oh man, yes or no's are hard these days. All right. And we acknowledge that Feb break is next week. How about that? We'll try that one, a yes or no. February break is next week.
We acknowledge that February break is next week.
I'm going to take that as a yes. Okay. And we acknowledge that it would be very difficult for an LSAT to be able to meet and convene during that time frame. So you're going to give people a little bit of extra time after February break to get the responses back in. You can't tell me the exact date today, apparently, but you're going to give people the extra time after the February break to get it in.
We're certainly sensitive to the timeline as it relates to February break. It will be a consideration.
This is why the community, the school community, has such a difficult time when you sit there and talk about transparency and open communication. Councilmember?
All right, I'll try my best here, I guess, with the last 2 minutes. All right, so schools are going to budget. They're going to figure out when they're due, which I think the answer is going to be after the Fed break. The budgets are going to help them determine what positions they can hire for. One of the things I'm concerned about is, and I know, Mr. Chancellor, you share this concern, is that we've got some positions for which we don't have any applicants in line to be able to be hired, correct?
I don't believe that's accurate. So you have to share a little bit more about what positions you're referencing. We have been working on building our applicant pool since the fall, and we have more applicants in the applicant pool than we had last year this time. And so we're working to ensure that there's a robust pool for school leaders to select from for any vacancies they would have for the 23-24 school year.
How many social workers are in the applicant pool right now?
I don't have that exact number for that category, but it is one of our priority areas, given the dearth of licensed individuals in that area.
And please take my comments to note. I know that you know that this is a priority position, so I'm not suggesting otherwise. But is it 0 in terms of the number of applicants that are currently in that portal?
Again, I don't have the exact number in that portal, but we have been heavily recruiting for priority positions where we know that we've been challenged this year, including not only this area, but also special education is another, language learning positions, world languages. And so we'll continue to recruit to ensure, again, there's a robust pool for principals to select from.
Okay. Since my time is up, could you follow up with the committee, or I guess with me and the chairman, around how many applicants do we have in the pool right now for those positions you just listed? And I know you have it in front of you, so if you could follow up after the hearing.
We can follow up.
All right.
What
Thank
were
you,
the
Mr. Chair.
positions again? Councilmember, what were the positions again? Social worker, what else?
I had social worker, but then the chancellor identified, I think it was about 3 different positions that you just listed, Mr. Chancellor.
What were
Yeah.
the positions?
We're happy to share our priority areas, but included special education as well, and language learning with the other one that I referenced.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember. Chancellor, did I hear you say in answer to one of the members that another one of the aspects of the law that's confusing or that you need more interpretation is the 4 categories in the law, the central, school support, school-wide, and local school?
So what I was pointing out, Chairman, is that the definition of what is in our categories currently in our budget model is clearly defined. In some cases, in the Budget Act, those categories are not clearly defined in the same.
Well, the definitions in the bill were taken from the budget book. Your budget.
And so again, I gave you the example earlier about general education.
No, I'm talking about the 4 categories.
Understand that, but
That's what I'm talking about. And you just said that they're not clearly defined.
so if you're referring to our categories, they're fully defined in our
Your
budget model.
budget book lists 4 departments. Your budget book says that the DCPS budget is divided into 4 departments. And they're the same departments we have in the bill, in the law. But was it also your testimony that the law takes away your discretion to increase or decrease special education or ELL personnel?
Well, I don't think it accounts for some of the uniqueness in a school's budget or FTEs that we're currently contemplating in our
Who
budget
accounts for
model.
that uniqueness now?
And so that's an annual review that we do based on our student population.
So who
each
accounts
of
for the
those.
uniqueness now?
That's a part of the DCPS budget development
So
process.
you account for that uniqueness now?
That is correct.
Okay, isn't that what the law said?
Well, I think the law is based on a number of minimums.
No. Paragraph 4, increase to fully reflect the increase of special education ELL personnel, special education or ELL personnel, so that the levels of such staff align with required service levels. That's your discretion. Decrease to reflect a reduced need for special education or ELL personnel to fully align with the required service levels. You're required now to provide ELL to or special education to align with required service levels, right? That's been part of the court
Correct,
process.
but
Okay, so you're required to do that now. You make that decision. It's unique. You said you're the one who makes that determination. This language says the same thing.
yeah, but our model accounts for additional dollars that are allocated to schools based on. the
Where here
student
does it say you
population.
can't do additional dollars? Let me see. After paragraph 10, after completing the calculations set forth, the school's annual budget may be increased by an amount, if any, agreed to by the chancellor. So I'm just having a hard time understanding why you are saying that this law does not allow for you to make decisions about ELL. And this law says specifically that you make decisions regarding ELL. And your answer is, well, because you have to increase. Well, it says right here, you can increase.
Yeah, from my view, though, the model is based on the number of students in those categories.
No, where does it? I don't think you've even read this law.
And
So let me ask this question, Deputy Mayor. Why is it okay to disregard the law? And before you answer that, this law went through 2 hearings last January and last September. Your testimony at the September hearing focused almost entirely on the fact that this was going to blow your budget by $60 million.
So Chairman, may I
Let me
respond?
finish. This is going to blow the budget by $60 million. Now, the chief financial officer, who maybe you think works for the council, but the last time I checked, he's independent, gave us a neutral fiscal impact statement on this law. It will not blow the budget by 60. That was the only testimony. So we knew the outline, the parameters of this law months and months ago, last August. But the bill went through committee and was adopted on first reading December 6th. 2 months ago, 3 months before the mayor has to send her budget. All you have to do under this law is come up with the top line or bottom line, whatever you want to call it, the total amount of school gap. That's all you have to do under this law. I don't get why it's okay to just disregard the law. Deputy Mayor?
Thanks, Chairman. I also don't think it's okay to disregard laws, but we really do believe, Chancellor has shared, that we are not able to implement this law in the time that we have. And I hear from your questioning, that's not something that you agree with, and we have probably not done a good enough job explaining why. However, when we developed the DCPS budget model, it took us a year to do that.
To develop the model.
Correct.
Did it take you a year to come up with the budgets that haven't been released this week?
Once you've got the underlying model with its algorithms, intricacies, it doesn't take a year to develop school budgets, but to actually develop the allocations that are required, it does take a considerable.
The allocations within the top line.
The allocations that go directly to school, because what the model doesn't do, and this is probably.
Which
important,
model? The law?
The DCPS budget model, it does not do, is take the school as the starting point. It takes the student as the starting point. And if you have a system.
Okay, but we're talking about wherever you start. Here, it's real simple. You start with the school's current budget. Our budget office has already run 2 budgets for all the schools based on assumptions we came up with. We don't have access to the information you have. Let's just be clear for the record. You know what the enrollment is and the breakdown of the enrollment for every school next year. You already know that. And you also have a pretty good idea what the UPSFF. I understand Mayor has not met with the chancellor. You don't know precisely, but you have a pretty good idea. And you also know what the teachers union contract. You know everything. We've been able to run the model. I think it took a couple of days for our budget office to run it for 116 schools. And you're making it sound like this is a 6-month exercise to come up with that number.
Well, we've got some considerations that are not accounted for. So for example, at the level of a school, it may seem like it makes sense, particularly if it's a static population, but we have a system of 127 schools. There were, I believe, something like 3,000 students that came out of grade levels in schools that lost only between 1 and 24 students. That it's hard for us to find money to fund because those are what we would consider to be phantom students now in the context of the model. This is the argument we made in the budget. So if we have to find that money, call it $18,000 per kid times 3,000, very quickly to a large sum, we have to take it from some other school. But if your law is saying you can't reduce anybody, then our question is, where do you find the money you need to fund these vacant spots that students are not in? And the other point that I'll make about the model with the law, excuse me, Chairman, if I can just finish this very simple point. I don't mean to be disrespectful, but a lot of the questions you ask assume that classes are full. So you've got 25 students in a class. When in the reality, if you go to many of our DCPS schools, you often have class sizes that are lower. So if you lose a number of students, it might actually justify, based on the number of students actually in the building, the drawdown of a staff member.
The law accounts for that.
It only accounts for it if you lose a certain number of students.
You mean a
in
specific
grade.
number?
A specific number, yes.
Excuse me, I don't understand what you just said. So a school has an under-enrolled class and it loses a few more students. What are you going to do with that class? Are you going to discontinue it or are you going to continue it?
No, sir, what I would share with
No,
you.
no, just answer that question. What are you going to do? Continue the class or discontinue?
What I'm trying to share is that you are going to look to see if there's another class that's also under, you might combine them. And now you have a class that
Okay,
is a healthy
and the
size.
law doesn't prohibit that. Have you read the law? It doesn't prohibit that.
Yes, my reading of the law is that it does prohibit that. because
At
you-
where? It says that if the class sizes, if the population has diminished, if the population has diminished sufficiently that you don't need a teacher, according to the standards roughly correlated with the WTU contract, then you can reduce the funding equal to an FTE. So if you combine two classes and stay within the class size, then you can cut. It says that right here in the bill. The
So
law.
I think my observation would just be that's the reason it's so difficult to make school budgets according to the law. Because we don't fully know what's appropriate and sufficient or insufficient. This conversation is showing. It's those details that have to get written in technically.
Your model is more complicated than this is, and yet you're saying that this is too complicated. You get, that's really irritating to me.
Actually,
I'm
Chairman,
sorry,
I
but
don't-
that's,
I don't mean to irritate you. Simply sharing. I'm not saying it's more complicated. I'm simply saying it's different. And in order to fund schools, we have to have technical rules that we actually roll out in a similar fashion across all schools. What
Yeah.
is sufficient?
you
Is it
have a
15?
technical, you have
Is it
a tech-
11?
Deputy Mayor, you have the rules now. It's right here, the law. And if you don't like that, what about the class size, which is in your CBA? You've got that. So what is it that you need to know? This says you increase, if there's been an increase in enrollment sufficient to require additional FTEs, or decrease if there's been a sufficient decrease in enrollment to justify reducing an FTE.
How do you define sufficient?
Well, it says here. I have to find the correct paragraph. After the decrease, the school will still comply with the class size maximum set forth in the operative collective bargaining agreement. Define.
Class size maximum. What if it's smaller than? In other words, these questions I know feel like they're
Sure. So if the enrollment drops, only 13 kids, are you going to discontinue the class? We went through this a few minutes ago. You said
We
you
did.
might combine it. If you combine it, then you don't need the FTE. You're making this harder than it is because all these hypotheticals you're bringing up are not here. They're just not here. If you eliminate an FTE, because you don't need the class, and you can cut the budget equal to that FTE, something that DCPS has never done.
I think, Chairman, and again, I don't mean to sound argumentative, but I really do believe I'm trying to convey, we're trying to convey that this conversation we're having illustrates all of the ways in which we have to determine the rules. You're saying they're in the law, but we still have to interpret them with numbers and scenarios.
I'm not getting it. I'm just not getting it. This actually is a more substantive conversation in the last 5 minutes than I was able to have in that meeting with the chancellor and his budget staff, when all you guys kept doing was saying, well, we want to postpone this for a year, instead of trying to understand them. So it's pretty apparent to me, let me just say this for the record, this isn't a question, it's pretty apparent to me. The executive, no, the mayor, and maybe you guys, did not like this bill. You never testified in support of it, but you didn't have the courage to come forward with specific changes, maybe because the changes you're talking about are really hard to understand. And so the council passed this. The mayor didn't have the courage to veto the bill. So it's law, because she allowed it to become law. And so now what the executive is doing, what the mayor is doing, and you guys, is choosing to disregard the law. Let's just be clear about that. It is the law. Mayor never liked it. Rather than comply with it, just going to disregard it. And let me say this as well, because I see my note right here. 5% cut in a budget. If a school has a $5 million budget, it's a $250,000 cut. 3 positions maybe? School with a $5 million budget, it's not a very large elementary school, 3 positions get cut. School has a $10 million budget, like a high school. That's a $500,000, maybe 5 positions, and that's stability for the school? What would those positions be? It's a rhetorical question. In the past, it was a librarian. Maybe you can't touch librarian. Social workers, maybe eliminate a classroom teacher, make the class sizes larger because you're able to do that. There's nothing fine, there's nothing acceptable about a 5% cut in a school's budget, particularly when their costs are going up. So they have less purchasing power with the dollars they have, but then they have to cut positions. Just want to make that clear for the record. And if I'm sounding a little aggravated at this point, it's because I've listened to maybe 2 hours of testimony, basically gaslighting why it's okay to ignore the law. Let me ask my colleagues. Do you have any other questions?
Chairman, I would just
Councilor
like to say that it's very hard to sit and be accused of a lack of courage or bravery in this context. And I feel like it's important that we don't resort to those kinds of. I'll
Well, I
describe
will
it as
say that
insults.
because the mayor opposes the bill, but she didn't veto it. And it is the law. And I went to a hearing last September, 2 hearings on that bill. That's unusual. Where I got testimony about how this was going to cost $60 million, or actually maybe more. And we got a clean fiscal impact statement from the chief financial officer. And because just like the criminal code reform bill, the mayor can't set forth what her objections are in a clear way that we can deal with them. I made a lot of changes to this bill as it went through. But, you know, all this vagueness and so forth, this is kind of typical with this legislation, with the criminal code reform bill. The mayor's objections today are different than the objections she raised in October, which are different than the objections she raised in November. They're different than the objections she raised in December. We're not here on that bill. We're on this bill. The committee report explains the different provisions in there, but you're bringing up concerns that you didn't bring up last fall about vagueness in certain terms. That's not really, I'm getting off on something that really isn't. You objected to my talking about courage.
Correct.
So I'll bring it back to that. Mayor didn't support the bill. She should have vetoed it.
That's your perspective and your opinion. I have sat with you in private and in public, stating very clear objections to this for 2 years.
Not
And
very
we're doing
clear.
that now.
Not very clear.
I feel like they're clear to me, and if I haven't been able to make them clear to you, then that's on me to do a better job. But I don't think we should, I just don't think we should diminish the conversation by actually starting to sling around insults. I don't think it does any of us any.
Well, the objection that I remember was the one on fiscal impact. It was going to cost too much. And to be sure, the chancellor will have less flexibility with this law with regard to central, because he will have the inability to cut school budget, which is the whole point of this, is not cut school budget. But if he wants more money for central, he can ask the mayor for more money for central. Nothing in this law prevents that. But I'm sorry, Deputy Mayor, that was the principal objection that I recall from the hearing in September, was the cost of the legislation and also the lack of flexibility. Mr. Fruman, do you have any questions?
I do. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to pick up just a little on the reference to the 5%, because I remember when that 5% rule was created, and the whole idea of that 5% rule was to protect schools in a setting where enrollment was declining precipitously, to avoid a downward spiral. But it worries me that that 5% rule might come into application in the setting where there has not been a decline in enrollment. And I think that we're going to see lots of places where we don't see declines in enrollment, and I worry that we're going to see cuts. And I also, on the 5%, we talk about 5% of the budget, and the chairman referenced this also. That's not the same as 5% decrease in buying power. And I thought I understood the chancellor to suggest that the increases in the teacher pay and the increases in the administrator pay will not be part of the budget amounts that we see that would be subject to the 5% floor for a cut. Is that right, Chancellor Farabee, that we'll see teacher costs and administrator costs based on the same scale that we saw last year?
That is the plan. That is correct.
And those often go up year to year because of the mix of teachers and administrators and level of seniority. So they can go, it's typical that they've gone up year to year. So even if you don't have that, the increases in the teacher pay and administrator pay, a 5% cut would be between 5 and 10% in terms of a decrease in buying power. And that might happen are you telling me that might happen in a school where there's no decrease in enrollment?
Well, I think if it's a school where there's a consistent enrollment year over year, there could be programmatic changes, and there could be changes to student need. There also could be a gap in one-time resources that a school was allocated as well, which may result in an overall top line number that is less than what they had the previous year. And so there are a number of factors that could potentially impact a school budget in that way.
So, and is that, you had said that there were 3 reasons that a school's budget might be cut. Were those the 3 that could be a change in program?
So primarily, outside of one-time funding, and again, I want to reiterate that we've seen a huge infusion of historic investments in recovery funding, but typically it would be programmatic changes, changes in the student population, and then changes in enrollment. I believe you were asking about scenarios in which enrollment was not a factor.
So where there is, if we see cuts in buying power, I hope that you will would you be willing explicitly to explain why it is, whether it's the program changes in the mix of the needs of the students, or changes in enrollment? Because if those are the reasons why it might make sense, will you tell schools where there may be buying power cuts, which one of them you're relying on?
Yeah, in the school budget, they receive what we call a school narrative of their budget that provides some of the details that you you referenced. And so it's my hope that any questions that comes along those lines will be clarified through the narrative that they will receive for their budget.
Yeah, I mean, I guess you can feel it, I'm nervous about what might be coming. And I'm also nervous about what might be coming, given the schedule stuff that's been talked about. So I hear you that this has been a particularly complicated year for you all to deal with this and get budgets out. New teacher contract, all different kinds of things that are in play. But I hope you recognize the challenge that school communities will face if they get a budget that is like the kind of scenario that the chairman was talking about, where they have to cut 3, 5, 10 positions, and they get it late this week and have to respond to it by in the week of break. And so I hear that you won't commit to offering enough time after the break for school communities to have meaningful input on this. But I want to, underscore really strongly that I hope you will, because boy, if you cut school budgets, cut buying power of school budgets, and then give people a few days into break to respond, you will see school communities all around the city with the same level of frustration that you're seeing from the chairman today. So I hope you won't do that. I hope you'll give people time. On the too many schools, Deputy Mayor Kine, we spend an enormous amount of money on school administration, and it wasn't just one letter that you sent to the Public Charter School Board. You did it two years in a row, where you said, please, in effect, please don't open new middle and high schools, and they did it anyways. And they did it anyways in an environment where you were saying, please don't do it. And we were projecting very significant growth in enrollment that's different than we're growing again, and that's good, but not anything like what was anticipated at the time that you said, please don't do it. Now they may do it again. They may open new schools again. And I hope that you'll be as strong or stronger now about being careful not to keep spreading the peanut butter so thin, because I've heard you say a couple of times in budget forums that we invest the most in our schools, and that's great, but we have to spend it in a way that's economically efficient. And we're facing these challenges inside of all the individual schools because of the way in which we're spreading it so thin. So I hope you'll take that very seriously if in this application process, and also as you're thinking about the student assignment and master facility plan, because it's an easy sentence to say that it's very important to us to have successful neighborhood schools, but in order to get there, we need to be investing in a way that's different than the one we're investing today. And we have to be real about the relationship between the two sectors and how we're going to plan together. So I hope you will take that to heart.
Thank you, Councilmember. I know that wasn't a question, but I'll offer a slightly friendly emendation to your statement. I didn't expressly say, don't create new schools. I felt obliged to start contributing a very strong fact base to the consideration about new schools across the city. And that's what I did, pointing out things like enrollment ceilings, planned growth, and so forth. Secondly, I'll just share, I actually try not to live in a world in which we have two sectors, meaning DCPS has a number of neighborhood schools. It also has citywide schools. It also sometimes plans to open new schools or shift resources, grow its enrollment in certain schools in the same way that charter LEAs do. And I think that we have to look at this all collectively and make the right decisions for ourselves and our families as a city, and not simply stand on one side of what I would consider to be an artificial line and point fingers across that line.
Okay, well, thank you for the friendly response. And I effectively said, please don't. And, that's a characterization of what you said I thought that the letters that you sent were great, and I was really glad to see it. And you're right that, we need to be disciplined in both sectors about opening new schools. There is a set of schools that are distinctive, and they are the matter of right schools in our neighborhoods. And that's the core of the system. I know not everybody goes there, but the whole idea, and I think people have acknowledged it over and over again, is that we want to make those places strong enough that they look like real options for the communities that they serve. And that's a fundamental obligation here. And if we go off and just open an indefinite number of additional schools, we make that harder and harder to do. And I've not heard a politician who said, no, that's not important. We don't need to have great neighborhood matter of right schools in every community. Never heard anybody, any elected official or any senior government official say that. But if we're going to achieve the goal, we got to be serious about it. Again, not a question.
Yeah. And I'll respond to your non-question simply by saying I could not agree with you more. We have an incredibly strong commitment to our neighborhood schools. And the good news is they have been improving. Many are growing in enrollment. The recent tutor results from DCPS on the NAEP scores across DCPS's schools were actually extraordinary in how we managed to hold our students learning harmless during the pandemic, unlike any other jurisdiction. So we have a lot of proud work, and we continue to invest and recognize the importance of our neighborhood schools. So thank you for that, council member.
All right, thank you very much.
Thank you, Councilmember Fruman. Councilmember Bond?
Thank you, Chairman. I just have a few questions. Just wanted to follow up and ask the Chancellor and also the Deputy Mayor, if he cares to respond. How do you define the need? And what I'm speaking of, you mentioned the need as you were talking about, I believe, your revised budget model. So what goes into the need?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Councilmember Bond. And so when we look at need, we look at historical performance and where we see where students have not experienced the same level of success that we expect for all of our students. In those categories, one, students receiving special education services, students receiving English language learner services, and students that are identified at risk, which could be based on financial status of the family, or students experience homelessness, or students in care of the district. And then we also look at the concentration of those students within the building, understanding that when a school has a higher concentration of those populations, they have a different challenge, and resources are often needed at a higher level to be responsive to those needs.
Okay, so in this discussion about matter of right schools versus, let's say, a feeder school, a matter of right school that is located in a area of the city that is considered high poverty, maybe special need, low literacy rate. Would that school qualify? Would those determinations help the school to qualify for additional funding?
Yes, Councilmember Bond. So the school population that you described in our model, that school would receive additional resources. And again, many of the schools that would be in that similar category receive additional resources in the fiscal year 23 budget as well.
Okay, and so they receive the additional dollars. And so we can anticipate in your upcoming budget that those monies would not be decreased, correct?
Yeah, it's safe to assume that, knowing, however, though, that there could be other changes. So for example, if that school that we are speaking of had a dramatic shift down in enrollment, that could impact their budget. If they had programmatic shifts, meaning they had special classes of population added or removed from their school, that could also impact their budget as well. But the overall principles of what we described in terms of characteristics of the population, assuming that they have consistent enrollment, we would expect them to see a similar, if not more, dollars in their budget for fiscal year 24.
Okay, so then a school that is historically, the historic performance is identified as being having low literacy rate, having in poverty. You're saying if something changes in that environment, they would get less money. That's what you're telling me. And I'm saying to you, how can that be? How cruel can we be to the community that we've already identified has tremendous need? They will never be able to recover if we're going to treat them like, well, this little piece here didn't work. And this is getting to this whole issue of whether or not we are as a community committed to making sure that the budget that the schools have now will not decrease. Do you see what I'm saying?
I understand what you're saying. Again, but there are, again, factors that could impact that budget, but we see overall, the majority of the schools that you're describing do see an increase in their budget, or their budget remains stable. However, if a school in the categories that you described, let's say they have 500 students this year, and they're projected to have 300 students next school year, we do account for that decrease in enrollment.
So instead of closing the school and merging it with the population in another school, you're going to give it less resources. Am I correct? And it stays open.
Well, it could be they have less resources, but all schools are still going to be held to 95% of what they had the year before. And I don't recommend a school closure in that situation, because enrollments do fluctuate year over year. And we have seen schools across the district most recently been able to increase their enrollment. And so we want to ensure that schools have resources to continue the supports for those families that are currently choosing that school.
Okay, Mr. Chancellor, I guess you have already transmitted to the council a list of schools that currently have under enrollment ceiling. Am I correct?
Yeah, all schools have the 95% ceiling.
They have 95% of the enrollment capacity, is what you're telling me?
Oh, in terms of enrollment?
We're talking about enrollment right now. Mm-hmm.
Right, and so the enrollment projections are developed through the Deputy Mayor's Education Office that informs our allocation that what goes to school.
And Councilmember, I'll just add in here, we have we have every year produced the Master Facility Plan Supplement, which gives, I think you're talking about the utilization rates of every school, which tells you how much their enrollment differs from their size.
Yes, and you have already submitted that for this year.
We convey that every year. Let me see, have we submitted? Yes, we've submitted that for this year.
All right. Can you make sure that I get a copy of that?
Very happy to, Councilman. We'll send one to you directly.
Thank you very much. I guess I'm trying all kinds of ways to see how I can help my school system be compliant with the law. We don't want our school system to be outside of the law, but it's very clear that it's one of the most difficult things we've encountered because we seem to be operating in two different systems. The council and our responsibility of allocating the dollars, and the school system in allocating really how it's going to be spent. And so It's a little disappointing. I thought that we were all together. But I see that we have a difference of opinion. Just understanding math, I can tell you, we can create all kinds of formulas. And the formulas can show disparity across the board, or they can somehow needle away in areas that we know we need the resources. And what I was asking earlier is a situation where maybe the enrollment is not where we would like it to be, as high as it wasn't at the ceiling, but the neighborhood is a neighborhood of great need. And I know that you've set 25 as the class size, but what if for fifth graders, let's say in a school, you only have 32? Do all of them go into one class? Or do we get 2 teachers? Wow. What would your analysis be in that situation, Mr. Chancellor?
Yeah, so it would depend upon the classroom for that grade level. And so each grade level has class size maximum based on our contract with the Washington Teachers Union, but there are scenarios in which we combine classes. The Deputy Mayor of Education mentioned that earlier. We do review class sizes as the school year starts. That's the one way that we utilize our enrollment reserve, where we allocate additional positions to schools when they exceed their enrollment throughout the year to ensure that they have the appropriate class sizes. What we do once schools receive their budgets, they work directly with their instructional superintendent to help them schedule out their allocation of positions to ensure that their appropriate number of FTEs being positions that are allocated to each grade level in each course.
Okay, well, I see my time is up, and I see Councilwoman Lewis George waiting in the wings. So I will.
I sort of am the one who recognizes who's next.
I'm sorry, Chairman. I don't see you on my board.
That's because I've disappeared. Are you done with your questions, Councilmember Bonds?
I guess so. I mean, I'm trying all kinds of ways to get the chancellor and the deputy mayor to be compliant with DC law. But I'm not come up with an angle yet. So I suppose, yes, sir, I'm done. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Bonds. Councilmember Parker, do you have any more questions?
Yes.
And then Councilmember Lewis.
I want to pick up on this thread of adhering to the law and the law that has been passed, the schools first budgeting approach. How long, Chancellor, and let me say this, and we've talked about this, you did express your concerns about the legislation, which I think is fair. That said, it's still the law, and I don't want the narrative to be that the chancellor is not adhering to legislation coming from the council. So how much time would it take for DCPS to be in accordance with the law? Another year?
Yeah, I think that's reasonable. But again, to give you context, the current model we had was an 18-month process of engagement and development.
I understand. I do get that, and I'm sympathetic to that. What I'm hearing you say is it's not as easy as let's flip the switch and change our funding approach.
It's just certainly not that, and this is just from my experience and professional expertise. I think the fact that we haven't had any engagement directly with school communities about this budget model is also an area of concern.
So can we get one of these 2 commitments on the record that within a year's time, so what would that be? Before fiscal year 25, there's either plans to implement the law or amendments to it ahead of time so that you're ready to implement the law?
Yeah, I think we've been committed to collaborating. As the chairman mentioned earlier,
So
You know,
hate to cut
despite-
you off. So I just want a firm commitment by fiscal year 25, DCPS is committed to implementing the law.
Well, we're always committed to implementing the law. We want to be in compliance with the law, but I think we also have a lot of work to do
Understood.
to be responsive to that. And you have my commitment to continue to do that work. I believe.
But in
that
your
those
judgment,
conversations-
a year's time, that window of time is enough time for DCPS to be in accordance with the law.
I think it's reasonable, but there's
Okay.
still some work that we need.
All right. So to my colleague, Councilmember Bonds, Chairman Mendelson, we have a commitment that by fiscal year 25, look, I think I see a smile coming, that we will have DCPS in accordance with the law. I would say in the meantime, the principle behind the law is that no school would see a decrease in its budget from the previous school year. It seems as though what you're preparing to roll out to schools will not live up to that. And that's referencing this 95% number that keeps getting thrown around. My question there is, how much ARPA funding is available that could potentially plug the gap in this next year while DCPS gets its act together to adhere to the act?
So again, I want to go back, what I communicated, I think there's a reasonable amount of time. I think what's yet to be determined, if we are only operating in minimum. We're saying that year over year, no school will lose dollars based on these conditions. There are budgetary decisions that need to be made in order for that to happen.
So
I
let me
wanna
ask
make
it this way.
make sure
How-
that we're making a commitment to that. In terms of the recovery dollars, it's important to note that we're in fiscal year 24 is the final year
Mhm.
of those dollars, much of which have already been allocated to our acceleration efforts in other areas for supporting curriculum, development for teachers, school leaders as well. So I don't see that as a.
Are you able to provide a dollar amount to how much money is left on the table?
Well, we will provide, as we have been, a account of all of our extra spending. We share that on our website. We'll continue to share that information. But that is a separate process from how we build our budget.
I understand that. What I heard the chairman say is there was a concern about blowing the budget up by $60 million. That's a lot of money to ordinary folk, but in terms of the investment that the district got, it's actually not that much money. And so if in theory, we can hold schools flat while DCPS is afforded another year, while maybe not in total accordance with the law, in practice, we could hold school budgets flat is what I'm getting at. And so I would love to follow up about how we can make that possible, whether that is reducing the size of central office, support services, $60 million, if that is in fact the concern, that number, I feel like that's easy to come by in the size of the budget.
Yeah, I think there's two things I think about. One is, I think nationally, there's a funding cliff that public schools across America are going to experience, where we have access to historic one-time funding that won't be in front of us in the years ahead.
But in
We're
a
all
year's
gonna have
time,
to-
in a year's time, you would have done whatever behind the scenes work to bring DCPS in accordance. Period.
I think it's a reasonable amount of time to get there. And I've shared that earlier, but I think the challenge is when we're talking about holding school harmless and no reductions, what we haven't spent a lot of time talking about, what that means in all the one-time funding that they've experienced. And
I'm going to interrupt because I've said this before. The ESSER money and ARPA money is excluded from this bill. So you can talk about it till the cows come home. It's not part of the calculation. If a school got $500,000 in ESSER money this year, they're not entitled to it next year under this law. So it's just not a relevant point. The reality is that schools didn't get that much money. If I remember correctly, it's a relatively small amount of ESSER money that went to the local school. So it's really not even an issue. But the law excludes it. So this is part of why I'm so frustrated, is that by you bringing that point up, it's a false distraction. I guess we call that a red flag.
Yeah, so
and
I'm raising
yeah.
it because of the felt school experience.
yes.
And I think it's something that we're gonna have to grapple. I
And
think
what
the-
I'm
the
what I'm
other-
getting at is that it is simply unacceptable for DCPS to just say, we're not going to honor the law. And what I would rather hear is, here are the ways we're working to honor the law, and we need more time. I think my colleagues would receive that better than the powers to be just saying, we're not going to do it. And again,
Councilman-
I say that knowing that it's not solely your decision. I think you're made to come out here and face these questions, which I think is kind of unfair, but I'll move on. I think there's a way that we can fill the gap for a year's time with ARPA funding, even though ARPA funding is not part of the schools first budgeting approach.
So as you reflect on the question, I think the other thing to call out that I think is important is I also believe there is an inherent tension that we are going to have and having in a world in which the goal is to hold schools harmless. We heard that from Councilman Fruman earlier. Also in a world to allocate more dollars where we have need.
Hmm.
And I think there is a challenge in ensuring a world in which both are true.
So again, I'm pushing to get commitments. Can we at least commit that if a school does not have a decline in enrollment, their budgets will be held harmless? I guess what we're getting at is that DCPS seems to be opening the window to say, even if the school is the same size, even if the programming is the same, even if variables haven't changed, we can still reduce their budget by 5%. And that is the pain point.
Well, I think if schools don't have those types of shifts, they will see a budget that is steady or an increase.
But year after
Well,
year, when they don't have those decreases, we do see cuts. And I think I heard Councilmember Henderson say earlier, we hear the mayor say, we have historic investments in schools, while at the same time, principals are wringing their hands trying to figure out which positions they're going to cut. And I will move on. I just want to flag, Chairman, that the hearing for the public is also scheduled for next week. And so it may be worth us revisiting that as well, just knowing that people are on break. That's up to you, but just wanted to put that on record as well. Last thing I would just say, in terms of the reimagining programs, I know Dunbar is one of the high schools that are going through that reimagine program. There was money allocated for those schools. Does that go into a big pot that is then divvied up across DCPS, or is it allocated specifically for that school? And if so, who has discretion over how that money is spent?
And so, as I mentioned earlier, there are grants that are allocated to schools that have unique programming or circumstances. And so our high school redesign is an area that falls into that category. And so we base the allocation for that specific strategy based on the school's model.
But does the grant money that Dunbar received solely go to Dunbar? Or does it go into a big DCPS pot?
So whatever resources are a part of that redesign at Dunbar goes directly to Dunbar,
Only Dunbar.
only Dunbar.
And then does the principal have discretion over how that money is spent? Or is that central office that decides how that money is spent?
So the principal works with their school community to identify the resources, and then resources are allocated based on those needs. It could be positions, programming, curriculum, resources that would be allocated to the school for that specific purpose.
Gotcha. I know we're over time. I'll take my last 10 seconds to just say, again, it's unacceptable for DCPS to just say, we're not going to honor the law. And I know for a fact, principals and teachers have lost their jobs far less. That if a directive came down from central office and a principal said, I'm just not going to do that, I don't think they would be there long. And so I'm just finding it real hard for us to square how the rules are just different for the executive that feels as though they don't have to live up to the rule. And I would very much appreciate a follow-up to the council around what steps you're going to take in the next year to make sure DCPS is in accordance with the law, because I will concede that maybe a couple of months is not enough time for the entire system to change its budgeting approach, but certainly in a year, I think that's reasonable. So Thank you for the extra time. I yield back.
Not to get into a discussion with you, but I will reiterate that the objections that the executive raised at the September 16th hearing, I just reread the testimony, was that it was too fiscally expensive and unsustainable because of the millions, tens of millions of dollars. That was the testimony from the executive. As I said, in December, we got a fiscal impact statement on what the chief financial officer the cost would be, and it was 0. The legislation that was adopted was in final form on December 6th. So the executive knew then. The complication in terms of budgeting that DCPS claims is how they allocate within the top line. But the reality is that those are fine adjustments that aren't going to take that much time. They're not going to take a year. They're not going to take months to do those kinds of adjustments. I suspect that many schools will not see a cut when you apply this law to what the chancellor through his formula. And so there's no adjustment necessary there. But let me go on. We tried to explain all this on January 5th or when we had the meeting shortly after January 5th. And the only interest that was communicated to me was they wanted to delay the law a year. The law also requires that the mayor tell the schools what their budget is by last Thursday. The mayor chose not to do that. That's so difficult for her to do, to make the UPSFF decision by last Thursday. The mayor chose not to do that, even within their own model. And just remember, one of the reasons why DCPS can't do this law is because they don't know the UPSFF. Well, but they can do their model without knowing the UPSFF, or they're going to find out the UP same time. In any event, that's not on the schools that the mayor didn't announce what the UPSFF to them. It's on the mayor. She chose not to disregard that. I don't know what the mayor's planning, but I've seen this before. Trying to remember with last year's Budget Support Act. Mayor could conceivably send down budget, not in compliance with this law, but with a BSA provision that repeals this. Did that last year with the school resource officer. I happen to agree with her on the school resource officers, but she sent down a budget that funded the school resource officers in defiance of the law, although actually it was her prerogative as part of the BSA, and then included in the BSA a repeal of do that. Not really working with us, but it's clear that the executive doesn't like this law and they have no intention of implementing.
If I could just briefly, 30 seconds. I agree fully that it's unacceptable that DCPS is not in accordance. What I would think is a plausible need for additional time. And a principle that I support in the legislation is that more money is going to schools from central office. Even if that is not directly spelled out, in theory, that's what I would expect is happening and a lot of people would support. I would imagine there would need to be transition processes and timelines to make that. So just throwing that out as one of the many reasons and considerations why more time may be necessary.
Well, again,
I would expect that to be communicated to the council. And so I'm not making excuses for it, but we had a commitment for next year. So hopefully there's plans to follow up so we can have the information necessary.
what I was going to say is that if the way the teacher's contract is funded is through the increase in the UPSFF, which is the way the teacher's contract is going to be funded, UPSFF is much broader than the salaries paid to the teacher. It's the UPSFF funding the entire system. So there's going to be more money than just the teacher to DCPS. And even if there wasn't, so I'm just trying to cover both possibilities. This bill doesn't require any cuts. It just may mean there's less increases. More money to the system. Maybe all of it goes to the schools instead of the center. Just don't read cuts into this. There's not cuts to central. We had in fact, part of the opposition that the executive expressed at the September 16th hearing was that we had in the bill at that time a cap on how much money went to central. We took that out. There's nothing in here cutting central. Councilmember Lewis Short.
Thank you, Chairman. Chancellor, Deputy Mayor. This is incredibly disappointing. As I was listening in earlier, that you all are somehow, and I don't believe this, but it feels like you all are disconnected from what's happening every day in our schools. Because I've been to our schools this year. I have had the opportunity to talk with our principals, our APs, our school leadership teams. They are exhausted right now. They are tired right now. And I am worried about, by this decision, that we're going to lose more good principals. We're going to lose more APs. We already have clinical psychologists and school counselors leaving because of their incredible case workload that's impossible for them to do. And that's what I'm hearing on the ground right now. And so what you have are principals who are acting as nurses and school counselors and behavioral health specialists and substitute teachers and assistant principals who are doing the same thing. And now they have this anxiety, and this is what I'm hearing, a very real anxiety about what is going to be in the school budgets when they get them. They have very much anxiety about what, if any, cuts are going to be there. There seems to be people are saying, we hear there's going to be cuts. There's rumors of all these cuts happening. And so I don't read the room. The room is, you have principals who are tired. They are fighting with facility issues, anxiety about doors not locking. They are having to make up for the mental health crisis and lack of supports that they have right now. And now we are saying to them, by not delivering a school budget on time, that, you know what, during your break, you're going to have to work, principals, even more than you've already been working. Many of them work I know principals who had to work during the Christmas break, did not get to spend time at Christmas because they had facility failures. So we don't care that we have overburdened you, overworked you at all. We're going to just get you a budget when we get you a budget. The uncertainty, the anxiety that's caused by the lack of predictability, the lack of stability, this is going to cost all of us. Scoring political points, playing political games, is going to cost all of us. Mostly it's going to cost our children the most. But we're going to lose more educators than we're already losing. We're going to lose more good principals. We're going to lose more school support staff because we're losing them because of this. Why create this level of anxiety and stress and instability for our schools? Why? What are you going to do? Where are you going to be over the spring break? Because now our principals can't even get a break to do that. Now they're going to have to come up and have LSAC meetings suddenly and make this happen. We can't get any certainty at all. We come here today and we don't have a date of any certainty. We don't even have a date when it's going to be due back. This is ridiculous. And I don't and take the political games out of it. It's going to cost people. Our principals are burdened and stressed. Our school staff are burdened and stressed. As a result, our students are going to be harmed. All this talk about held harmless, nobody's held harmless because of this. This is ridiculous. I don't think there's any acceptable answer for it. It really isn't. Go. I mean, I don't know if you all are just, there's a disconnect between what's happening every day in our schools. Like, but this is what I hear and see. And I don't want to lose good principals and good assistant principals and good school staff because we're playing games. That's costing all of us. So I'm going to stay there. That's I just have to say, this is beyond disappointing. It's beyond ridiculous. But I really want you to think about the human impact. These are families. These are children. These are educators and professional lives that we are playing with. And we're going to lose as a district as a result of it. I do want to ask a few questions regarding, which has been mentioned previously, the enrollment reserves. Because what I am hearing and seeing on the ground is that the enrollment reserves have not been used in fiscal year 23 to actually support the schools, to provide mid-year support for our schools. As you know, there have been new arrivals to many schools with migrants, and not only the migrants, but students who leave the charter sector and enter the public schools sector. So I'd want to know, have you actually used the enrollments reserves to support and provide mid-year support for our schools thus far?
Yes, we have. Councilmember Lewis George provided resources to schools throughout the school year via our enrollment reserve. It is the one part of resources that we have to ensure that if there are any shifts or unexpected changes in schools, we're able to allocate additional resources. We specifically have used a good portion of that for our migrant families that had unique needs that we've been responsive to. I believe also the council reduced the enrollment reserve amount for this current school year that we're in as well. So we would hope that that wouldn't occur as we go forward, because that does allow us to have additional resources throughout the school year as the system of right.
So from what you're saying is, because we've had a number of schools who have had new arrivals either via migrants or transfers from charter sector, that those funds are have already started expending fiscal year 23 enrollment reserves to support our schools.
Yes, we have issued those dollars, yes, to schools based on the needs. And I believe the enrollment reserve was reduced by council to pay for literacy training, if my memory serves me correctly.
I honestly, I'm not going to speak to that. I will let the chairman speak to that. What does it take for a school to get the mid-year support dollars? Because there seems to be a disconnect here. So maybe they're not qualifying to get the mid-year dollars. Is there a certain amount of students, new sort of additional students that sort of trigger getting this funding?
Yeah, so they can make requests directly to their instructional superintendent, who is often a broker for resources for schools when they need additional resources.
Okay. Well, I'm going to hope that we continue to evaluate that, because what I'm hearing on the ground is that a lot of the schools who've gotten new revivals have not gotten their mid-year support. And they desperately need that support and funding, and we should be using the enrollment reserve for its intentional purpose. Have the Deputy Mayor, are the enrollment projections done for fiscal year 24?
Yes, they are.
Okay. And when will we receive them? Or be able to see them? Or can you send them?
We include those, I'm sorry, just checking with my team here. We do include them with the school budget. So when the school budgets come out, they'll be part of that package of information. So that's shortly.
Okay.
So
So
we
when
base the school budgets on those enrollment projections. So as soon as the school budgets are out, we're able to share the projections, which we will do.
Okay. And I think my colleague, Councilmember Zachary Parker, was getting to this, and I don't know if we got a direct answer. Can we expect that if everything stayed the same, if the school enrollment remained the same, can we is there a guarantee that they will be held harmless?
Again, there's many factors and complexity within the school budget, so I can't make any guarantees on school budgets without knowing all the factors about their student populations and changes year over year.
But I mean, if there's no changes, then you don't, there's no other factors. There's no change.
Again, I think we need to clarify what all those changes could be. I think reasonably, if there's no programmatic changes, if there are no enrollment changes, if there are no changes in the need of that particular student population, it would be reasonable that their budget would be consistent or if not greater than what they received the year before.
Okay, I hope to see that when these school budgets are released at said unknown date at the moment. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you. Let me just clarify for the record. The enrollment reserve is included within the school-wide department of the DCPS budget. The school-wide department is approximately $80 million. We took, if I remember correctly, about $500,000, $600,000 out of school-wide for the literacy task force for letters for the curriculum. We took about $500,000, $600,000 out of an $80 million budget, but we did not take it directly from enrollment reserve.
My
Thank you.
understanding that was the category in which those dollars were taken.
And I'm telling you that they were not. There was a council member who opposed funding letters out of enrollment reserve. The budget comes through my office and the budget director for the council, their office. And the reduction of about $600,000 from an $80 million budget was from the $80 million top line for school-wide. It was nothing that indicated that it was specifically from enrollment reserve.
Okay, we're happy to follow up on that.
Send me the documentation that shows otherwise. Because as I said, we do the documentation for the budget. I have no further questions. Any council members, anything further from any council members? I know Deputy Mayor Kine indicated that has a family commitment. It actually is sort of school related. I said daughter leaving school, so but you had to leave it not at 6 and it's 5:59. This hearing is being recessed to February 24th at 1 p.m. and the record for this hearing will close in the reconvene notice. It says at 5 p.m. on March. The committee of the whole is also having the performance oversight hearing on DCPS on 2 dates. Public witnesses are March 1st and the government witnesses are March 3rd. The time is 5:59 and this hearing is in recess.